Going through my notes on video topics, I had one line written that said, "Literary it girls intimidate me." And that was the jumping off point for this. And so I started to do a bit of a deep dive into who is the literary it girl? Is the literary it girl a real person? Is she a good thing in the world? Is she good for the world of literature? Is she bad for the world of literature? Is she leading to a deadening of literary voice? And as I'm beginning this, though, I'm coming to the startling conclusion of realizing that I am indeed not a literary it girl, and I think maybe the reason she intimidates me is because I want to be her, but I fear that I might be instead a thought daughter. Okay. So the term thought daughter has its origin in an internet joke, pairing up the gay son and the thought, T-H-O-T, daughter, referring to a woman of questionable morals, I suppose. And then we have a further joke co-opting this and saying, oh, well, I think my parents got confused. They wanted to opt for thought daughter, and they instead got a thought, T-H-O-U-G-H-T, daughter. And now what is a thought daughter? Well, she is a girl who's into the intellectual pursuits. She's a girl who posts her reading lists online, and these reading lists are always uniformly literary fiction. They're literary fiction written by young women. They're works that are kind of dealing with topics like depression, sadness, the state of the world today. The thought daughter is concerned with the state of the world. She enjoys activities like aesthetic journaling. She likes art, perhaps. Analog media. She might have a big record collection. The thought daughter is an intellectual. And on the Substack People's Princess, the writer Sarah Cucciara describes the thought daughter as someone often highly intelligent, sensitive, feminine, but just to an extent. Relates to the media like Virgin Suicides, a Lana Del Rey listener, and a sentimental, nostalgic girl. She's nonchalant, your everyday girl, just constantly plagued by thoughts and very intuitive and smart. They like the conventional trappings of femininity to an extent. They might be partial to hair bows. They might wear Mary Jane shoes. Now, the thought daughter, though, the reason I mention her is because I think that she provides a useful way into understanding this kind of more confusing trope of the literary it girl.
I read an interview recently where someone described you as a literary it girl.
It's quite a pronoun, it, isn't it? Isn't it? To get to the point where anyone would plausibly call you any such thing, you need to have a very self-contained understanding of yourself and what you do. You will never write a good book if you pay too much attention to external praise or recognition.
Because we can understand what the thought daughter is. We can see her on our social media pages. We might know her in our real lives. However, the literary it girl we might not know personally. And now the thought daughter and the literary it girl are often described in conjunction with each other, or sometimes described as the same thing, the same person. However, I think there's a distinction here. And I think this distinction is for some reason important to make. I don't know, it probably isn't. This is probably just like the result of me spending too much time online and having too many ambitions to be a literary girl and finding that I'm not having any success in doing that, even though I'm 34 years old and really should have published about 5 novels by now, but whatever. What I would say is the thought daughter is effectively the consumer. The thought daughter consumes the media produced by the literary it girl. But then we get into the question of who then is the literary it girl and how do we understand her? She likes writing, and she approaches it not as an academic pursuit. She approaches it very much as a work of art. And this is another area where I think the literary it girl can be distinguished from the thought daughter, where the thought daughter is approaching the reading more as an academic pursuit, more as a way of learning about the world, yes, as a way of defining herself through the book she reads, but also as a way of saying like, oh, hey, look, like I am studying this, I'm being a student of the world, where for the literary it girl, this is more of a work of art. Now, remember first that we're talking about literary fiction here. We're not talking about sci-fi, fantasy, young adult, none of those. Definitely not romance. We're talking highbrow. The literary it girl is a highbrow writer. And what we also have to keep in mind about her is that she has her origins in writers like Joan Didion and Eve Babbitt's, key to the canon of the thought daughter's curated reading list. And so these writers provided maybe a blueprint for the literary it girl. They were young women writers, successful writers, quite stylish. I would say that's really what it comes down to. Woman writer who is quite stylish, and we could describe the literary it girl as such. Now, somewhat recently, there was an article in Nylon magazine about the makings of a literary it girl, which lays out a definition of the literary it girl that I think largely coalesces with what my own would be. They are savvy writers who are redefining what it means to market a book, and in doing so, tackling the challenges of self-presentation that every artist faces. What's key here is it's not only about what she writes. It's not in her craft, necessarily, that the literary it girl gains her prominence and her recognizability. It's not necessarily even that she's a great writer, it's that she knows how to present herself. She knows how to be very stylish, she knows how to be very cool. Eleanor Stern writes on Substack, "Suffice it to say, the general vibe of this stuff is thin, expensive, self-conscious, social media oriented. And this is fine. This is not new, regardless of annoying recent discourse about the supposed rise of the literary it girl. Since at least the Romantics, there have been ambitious, arty young people getting together to read stories and poems, and it feels kind of mean to say anything about them other than that they put themselves out there, offering up free entertainment to strangers." And I agree with this to a point, but it does seem that in the current literary world, there's something else at play. It's not just people putting themselves out there and attending fancy literary events, or maybe I'm just getting this wrong because I've never attended a fancy literary event, but it does seem to me that we're operating in a state of more urgency in the current age, where it's becoming harder to sell books as social media comes to increasing prominence, and so writers have to be cleverer and cleverer in figuring out ways to market themselves. And young female writers know that they're tapping into an audience of young thought daughter type girls who want to read something literary, but also want to feel that they are kind of cool and stylish and special through reading this. They don't just want to read the books for the sake of reading the books. They want to have the books as almost an accessory. And so this is maybe where the idea of like literary it girl intimidating me came from, because it's not just to be a successful writer, you have to master your craft. To be a successful writer, you also perhaps have to master the art of self-presentation, and you have to have a certain stylish aesthetic and persona in order to like have any chance really of getting yourself published perhaps, or getting anyone to read your book. But still, as I go through all of these so-called traits of the literary it girl, I feel like I still don't really know who she is. And there was a Substack essay on literary it girls that essentially said that she's not a real person. But I do kind of tend to disagree with that. I think that the literary it girl very much is a real person. I think she does exist. I think that she is a certain type of writer who we are seeing today gain a certain level of audience and level of success among a certain type of young female demographic. But still, even so, I'm kind of still like, I'm not sure I get it. I decided I needed to devise a categorization strategy. And so next, I'm going to present to you my matrix of literary women and literary it girls. Now we've reached the part of this project where I can't tell if it's funny or sad. It was supposed to be the funny part, but now that I'm like sitting here actually doing it in my living room with a whiteboard, with my chaotic cool matrix here, I'm like, I overthought this way too much, didn't I? I got so obsessed with like precisely identifying what I mean by the term literary it girl that I have like literally developed my own categorization strategy. What we have here is the chaotic cool matrix, and you too can now use it to determine whether your favorite writer is or is not a real, true, bona fide literary it girl in this current day and age. Without further ado, let's get into it. So, along the x-axis, we have cool. Now, this would be very uncool, this would be very cool. And what I mean by cool is a very self-aware indifference to what other people think of you. Then we have the chaotic y-axis, which refers to the level to which you make erratic and unpredictable decisions in your day-to-day life. And so on this matrix, essentially, the literary it girl would fall way up at the top. of both chaotic and cool. The quintessential literary it girl is very cool. She doesn't care what people think about her, and also she might seem very unpredictable in her life. You don't know what she's gonna do next. Anyway, shall we get started with categorizing some writers? So I wanted to start with the grandmother, as they say, of the literary it girl, Joan Didion herself. And now, as I thought to place Joan Didion on this matrix, I thought, well, she seems very cool. Like, I don't think she cares what anyone thinks of her. She is very nonchalant. She is very at ease in herself, I think. The other disclaimer here should be that I don't know any of these writers. I've never met them. And so everything here is just like my own conjecture about what they might be like from whatever media I have consumed that they have created, or media about them that I have consumed. So anyway, Joan Didion, very cool. However, when I think about Joan Didion, I do not think chaos. I do not think erratic behaviors. I do not think irresponsible decisions. And so we are putting Joan Didion in approximately this spot. Joan Didion does not come out as a literary it girl in my formulation. And now you might think, oh, your whole system's broken down there. No, it has not. No, it has not. Because, in fact, what I always read in the discourse about the thought daughters and the literary it girls is that Joan Didion would have hated this. She would have thought it's so stupid. And so I think, in fact, makes a lot of sense that she would not qualify as a literary it girl in our contemporary labeling system. Let's move on. Next, we're going to have Eve Babbitt's placed. Now, Eve Babbitt's, likewise, I think of her as quite cool. I don't really know, but she had that like 70s LA vibe. I think that's pretty cool, pretty nonchalant, pretty like, don't care what other people think of me attitude. And I would also say, based on what I've read about her, she seemed quite chaotic. And so she gets our first spot as a true literary it girl. Okay, now let's move into the modern age. And when you think of modern writers, who do you think of? I bet you think of Sally Rooney, because she's supposedly the voice of the millennial generation. And so when I think of Sally Rooney, though, I'm not sure she gives off a real cool vibe. I think she gives off a very nervous energy in many ways, a not quite comfortable in her own skin energy. There's no shade to her. I don't give off a comfortable in my own skin energy either. So I can't give her a high cool ranking. And also, I would not give her a high chaos rating. She seems very controlled, very in charge of herself. And so Sally Rooney, we're going to put her... There we've got Sally Rooney, not a literary it girl. Again, I think that's true, because when we get into what a literary it girl really is, I don't think she does the things, I don't think she engages in the behaviors of the literary it girl. But let's move on. Another commonly associated with the literary it girl label would be the one and only Ottessa Moshfegh. Now, the impression I have of Ottessa Moshfegh is that she is quite cool. I mean, you look at her choice of subject matter in My Year of Rest and Relaxation, in Eileen, in other short story collections, and she's willing to take some risks, make some unpredictable choices. And so I would actually put her very high in the cool ranking, because she clearly just does not care what other people are thinking of her. However, does she strike me as chaotic? Not really. Maybe a little bit, but I'm not going to give her a high chaos rating. So we're going to put her there. Again, not a literary it girl. And so as I categorize these writers, I really start to worry, do we have any modern literary it girls? Or are all of our modern writers, in fact, not it girls at all? And this whole thing is fake and none of it is real, and I just wasted all this time on it for nothing? No. Because as I thought about who would fall high on the chaos cool scale, a certain writer who I've known about for quite some time, ever since my magazine reading days, came to mind, and that is Kat Marnell. Now, Kat Marnell was a magazine editor, writer, I believe. She also, more recently, wrote a book, a memoir called How to Murder Your Life. Now, if that doesn't indicate that she's high chaos, I don't know what does. She did murder her life. She had addiction issues. She destroyed her own hair. Like, she had trouble. But also, I think she comes off as very cool. I mean, she was a magazine editor, like a fashion magazine editor. Like, what cooler job is there? Like, that is the job of the 2000s, the woman's job. So I am giving Kat Marnell a pretty high billing in the literary it girl sphere. Let's put her on. Now, Kat Marnell, you see, she's even more literary it girl than Eve Babbitt's. Wow. And then I got to thinking further. I thought, okay, who is also talked about when they talk about literary it girls? Marlo Granados, who I will mention many times in this video, again, came to mind. And I thought, okay, like, she definitely gives off a cool vibe. Like, she seems like she loves a party. Like, she's very open and like outgoing and very fun. Like, you do get the sense reading her work that she would be fun to party with. So I'm definitely going to give her a high cool ranking. However, is she chaotic? Hard to say. Like, I don't have any evidence that she's super chaotic apart from her book Happy Hour, in which she writes about, like young women just kind of getting by in New York City, sometimes a little bit illegally. So based on that, I'm like, does she have personal experience of this? Who knows? Maybe. But for that, I'm going to give her like a mid-chaos billing. Now, does that count as literary it girl? I'm going to say yes, it does. So one of the most fascinating figures in all of this, and like definitely a subject of my previous fascination, like someone who I followed on social media in around like 2020, 21-ish, who like I could not look away from, would be the legendary figure of Caroline Calloway. Now I realize as I'm like talking about all of this is all just so incredibly online, isn't it? Like so many people would be like, who is Caroline Calloway? I also thought that back in 2019 when an article came out in The Cut called, I believe it was I Was Caroline Calloway. Now, this article was written by Caroline Calloway's former best friend, Natalie Beach, about her experience of ghostwriting Caroline Calloway's wildly successful Instagram posts, and in turn, being part of a literary duo that sparked quite a bit of controversy. Now, let's go into this a bit more, and then we're going to get into why I think that Caroline Calloway is a fascinating example of this idea of the literary it girl, maybe taking the type so far as to become something else entirely. So, going back to about 2012, when Instagram was in its early days, Caroline Calloway was an American student at the University of Cambridge in the UK. She posted photos of her enviable life on this iconic university campus, living this fairy tale dream of the American abroad, and she coupled these photos with long captions. It was, in effect, like she was a memoirist of the internet, and that is, in fact, what she was trying to do. She was very blatantly trying to be a memoirist when she was in her early 20s. As she's writing these posts, namely these long captions, she starts to gain traction, and guess what? She gets a book deal out of the whole thing. And so she starts writing her book, but then has a lot of issues with writing her book. She deals with Adderall addiction, she deals with upheaval in her personal life, and she ends up not actually publishing this book. Now, at the same time, though, she's looking to make some money. And so she also sells a series of creativity workshops where she's supposed to teach people, how to be creative. And these are basically a flop. They cost a lot of money, and she doesn't really deliver on her promises. And so she gets called a scammer. People are loathing her across the internet. But what she does here is very interesting. And this is the point at which I discovered her. And so in this controversy over being a so-called scammer and also being a wannabe public writer, she begins to really market herself as this scammer figure. She also adopts a persona of this wild bohemian living in downtown New York City. She has this apartment that's stacked with books. She painted her hardwood floors white, but didn't bother to move the furniture. She just painted around it. Images circulated the internet after she moved out of her apartment of the complete state of mess she'd left it in. But all the while, she was posting these pictures of herself attending these glamorous parties, wearing these beautiful dresses. And I was absolutely sucked in. I would read her captions and think, I wonder if she is a good writer. But what really got me was the imagery of her life, the persona that she was creating. Now, she did ultimately, after many, many years of not publishing a book, publish a book called Scammer. Full disclosure, I have not read it. I don't really intend to read it. I've heard that it's quite hard to get your hands on it anyway, and that you might order it and pay money for it, and it might not arrive in classic Caroline Calloway fashion. But at the same time, I'm also kind of it really worked for her, didn't it? To present this life, to present this persona. It allowed her to be the very thing she wanted to be, which was a public writer. And so this makes me think that maybe the literary it girls are onto something. Maybe this is how you as a young woman publish a book in the modern world. Maybe you do craft the persona first, and then after that, you're able to then do your publishing. And yet, as a reader and observer and wannabe participant in this literary world, I can't help but feel a little bit of envy for all of these figures, for Caroline Calloway and the others who are able to craft this image, this vision of this glamorous chaos in their own lives and use that as a marketing tactic. And maybe I should also disclose here that this is coming from someone whose first creative love was the performing arts. And this does kind of bring in some of the glitz and glamour of the stage performance, the way that the literary it girl markets herself, the way that she holds parties, the way that she presents herself on social media. All of this kind of leads to this image of performance. It's almost like this spectacle, and I think it's beautiful and interesting. I do want to be a part of it. And I think about my conventional vision of the literary world, and I think it's almost a world of extreme seriousness, of turning away from the idea of glamour because it's not smart, basically. And this is kind of reclaiming a sort of glamour as a smart thing, as a thing that an intelligent, interesting person can do. And you can be this glamorous figure in addition to writing your book. Now, I'm going to go back to the Nylon article here with a few more perspectives on this glamorizing of the literary scene. Now, here they talk about the release of Ali Rowbottom's book, Aesthetica. For Rowbottom's first book, Jello Girls, she took a more traditional approach to marketing, which usually involves bookstore events and often doesn't even include a book tour. But it didn't feel true to who she was, nor did she feel it was particularly effective. It didn't feel very true to who I am, and it didn't really yield the enthusiasm for the book that I wanted, or the readership, the cool, young, enthusiastic readers who I felt would be a good fit for my work, she says. Interesting that she has her target audience there as cool, young, enthusiastic readers. And so the book isn't for anyone, and I think the works of the literary it girls are not really for anyone. They are for these cool, young, pretty girls. And then we have Marlo Granados, author of Happy Hour, which is a book that I own and do very much enjoy, quoted saying, "It was always a little bit intimidating in a way because it didn't really mesh well with my own ideas and aesthetics and how I present myself. I think there's this disconnect for me, and I felt like a little bit of an outlier," Granados says. And so here in both of these quotes, we're really getting this idea of authenticity driven home, where as the young female writer, you want to kind of bring more of a party vibe to things, perhaps. You want to bring more fun to the work of writing and the work of promoting a book. And speaking again to the intended audience for literary it girl fiction, Granados says, "Really what happens is that if you have a demographic that is made up of young women, so much of that is also them talking to their friends and lending their books to each other and that kind of relatability. And so we have women writing for women, about topics that seem relevant to young women. Oftentimes the books will deal with depression, other mental health issues, might deal with, I've seen this a lot, really, like age gap relationships between a younger woman and an older man and the power dynamics implicit in that. These books might deal with sex, plastic surgery, they might deal with drugs. Like basically these are kind of getting into some of the grittier, more dangerous topics. And then the marketing of these books is very much focused on this idea of being cool and glamorous and being the type of young woman who isn't like the conventional literary critic scene. She's something else. She's something different. She's something more fun, more wild, more interesting. She is Caroline Calloway. She is chaos, and she is cool, and she does care about fashion, and she does love to like get dressed up and go to parties. She loves to have a cocktail. She loves to wear her high-heeled shoes and her glittery shirts, and she's me and I'm her, and we are all each other, and we're all reading each other's books, and I think I could love this, but like also then how do I gain entrance? As a potential creator or an aspiring creator of the type of literature that would be marketed to, say, the thought daughter type of girl, it's also incredibly intimidating. Like, isn't it hard enough to come up with a good story and to write it well and to write it with passion and emotion? Now you're telling me like I have to be like a clever self-marketer as well? Are we going to bring that whole pretty enough, young enough, thin enough requirement into the literary world as well? Like in this new idea of the literary world as a performance of glamour and fun and womanhood in a very perhaps sexualized way. Is that true? I don't know. It is the question of, well, who gets left out? Young men, for one. Quoted in Dazed magazine, writer Eliza Clark says, "White male novelists were so unbelievably overrepresented for such a long time. Certainly 15 to 25 years ago, boredom with the men's literary writing was totally justified. But now it feels we're tarring every single male writer with the same brush, including men from marginalized backgrounds. It's more important than ever to uplift the voices of young men of color, disabled men, working class men, and queer men. If we wish to truly champion diversity, we must include men." And indeed, fewer young men are being brought into the literary scene. And it's been hypothesized that maybe publishers aren't getting submissions from young men because young men don't have much interest in a career as a novelist. Or it could be that there's no interest in the books that they would publish, that they don't maybe have that easy marketability among a pre-built-in demographic like the literary it girl trope would have in the consumer base of the thought daughter trope. We don't quite have a young men's social media movement of young men posting their aesthetic reading lists, laying their books out on their bed and saying, "Isn't this beautiful?" Pairing their books with certain types of clothes or certain types of fashion. Like, men simply don't do this. And so if this is the only way to really sell books these days, or one of the only ways to sell books, at least in the literary fiction genre, where does that leave us in terms of young men? And then we also have this idea of literary scenes popping up, and the idea that if you are outside of one of the dominant scenes in one of the major cities of the world where you can hold these swanky, cool, glamorous literary parties, like, do you really have a place then in the literary world? As an aside to my old Caroline Calloway fascination, I wanted to say obsession, but I'm like, I don't think I was ever obsessed with Caroline Calloway, but like I did very much follow her movements, and not like physically, but like I followed the things she did and the parties she went to. And so here, this is where I came across the idea of the Dime Square, New York City literary scene, which is, you know, a literary scene that was centered around a certain area of downtown Manhattan, where a group of kind of stylish, probably quite wealthy young people were creating supposed art, going to parties, having a good time, whatever. Out of this came, you know, for a brief time period, the print newspaper, The Drunken Canal, which featured writers writing kind of like offbeat pieces that, I mean, I did read some of them like online, and I was a little bit like, I'm not sure about the writing here, but I appreciate the effort to bring back print journalism. We also have writers like Honor Levy in that scene, you know, kind of writing this very tense, intense auto-fiction about her own life and her own experiences and her own observations as a woman on the internet. And it all feels very cool and very dangerous, and indeed quite scary, because I'm like, am I cool enough to write this? As I was doing the research so I could talk about all of this, and like, a semi-coherent, knowledgeable manner. I mean, don't take me as the authority here on anything. Like, I know I could have included publishing industry statistics and stuff, but guess what? I was like, did I want to? No, because like I'm just a person in a bedroom chatting. But as an aside, as I was like trying to do my research here, I thought for a moment, like maybe I should like pick up some of these literary it girl books and see how they are. And I mean, now like I've already read like a few that would like definitely be put on lists of literary it girls, you know, whether I truly believe that they fall into the true literary it girl categorization. Like, as I've said, I've read my year of rest and relaxation. I enjoyed it. I have read all of Sally Rooney's novels. I've read some Joan Didion. I've read some Eve Babbitt's, you know, I've read Happy Hour. These are the only two I actually have to hand right now, but you know what I mean? Like, I've read them. And yet, as I was considering like, oh, maybe I should read a few more, maybe I should take notes on the genre, maybe I should think more about what topics are covered, I kind of just got so fatigued by the thought of going to the bookstore, picking up one of these books and then having to read it. Like, I kind of got to this point of being like, oh my God, well, isn't it just going to be like a lot more of the same? Like, is it going to be another one of those stories where I enter it with very high hopes and yet I kind of wind up being like, I feel like I've heard this before, you know, I feel like this is not doing anything new and it's not really pushing the boat out in terms of language. Like, you know, and it's like, I don't want to like tar and feather the literary it girls and say none of their books are good, because I have enjoyed many of their books. I love My Year of Rest and Relaxation. I love Happy Hour. I love Normal People. The other, Sally Rooney's other two, I'm like not completely sold on, but also like kind of read those other two in bad periods of my life. So maybe I unfairly judged them and should revisit them. Anyway, not the point. The point is that I don't want to be like, oh, these books are bad, because they're not. Like, they are in many cases good, interesting, like entertaining literature about topics that I, as a woman in my 30s, I guess now, but also I've read some of these in my 20s, but a woman of this general age range, like that I relate to, like I enjoy it. And yet at the same time, it feels sort of tired sometimes. It feels at the same time like all of this buzz gets built around these books, but then the reading experience, the actual reading experience just falls flat. Whatever it is though, like I appreciate these young women's desire to make a kind of like more fun sociability out of like the pursuit of, you know, semi-serious literary fiction. I appreciate them trying to like breathe new life into a literary scene. I appreciate them trying to get books sold and get books into the hands of readers. I appreciate them for knowing who their target audience is and for creating books for that audience so that these people do pick these books up and enjoy them. And I also appreciate, I'm going to say it, I appreciate the Thought Daughters for posting their reading lists online, and I appreciate them for connecting with other Thought Daughters over their shared interest in these books. And like, I think that's all a wonderful thing. Like, I, for one, I don't really resonate with that image of like the recluse writer. Like, as someone who likes to write myself, I very much find like this kind of sad girl, like alone in the attic writing her novel image to be like quite boring and honestly quite undesirable. Like, I want my writing to be grounded in the real world, and I want to have real experiences around writing and finding topics for writing. I want my stories that I eventually do write to be drawn from like a very like vivid picture of reality that I've gained from my own life. Like, I want that. And so I think it's great that like we're getting these books that are like kind of trying to be more of that. And maybe my slight obsession with the literary it girl comes in fact from a bit of insecurity in my own voice and a bit of a lack of confidence ultimately in my actual ability to have these sensational experiences, to live this life that's maximally cool and chaotic. Maybe I just don't trust myself enough. And so like I fear that I won't be able to be like the cool, perfect party girl who's also like a really like incisive writer and social critic. I worry that otherwise, without being like a master of clever self-marketing, my writing will never get noticed. I kind of hate to say it, but in this like image-driven internet age, I do kind of fear that that might be true. And so it kind of goes both ways, where like I love what literary it girls are potentially doing for literature to bring it more to the masses, so to speak, to involve more people in the act of reading, but also like I find it scary in like in upping the stakes and upping the requirements for what you have to embody and what skills you have to possess as a writer, and also perhaps what social network you have to possess as a writer, what scene you happen to belong to, whether you're cool enough and hot enough to be part of the Dime Square set because that's where the publishers are going to go to like find their next big thing, perhaps. Like maybe that is what scares me and that's what intimidates me. And so really when I wrote that note saying, oh, literary it girls intimidate me, that's the fear that I was tapping into in myself. And now like over the course of all of this, I notice also that I have like completely lost like the light. Like I'm ring lighting it here in the dark of my office. And so as I like ponder this idea of confidence as I go forward into apparently the dark of my night, I am going to leave a quote from Tessa Moshfegh, one of the possible literary it girls, certainly a writer who writes in the genre perhaps of the literary it girl, but who might not embody the actual literary it girl spirit in herself, because I think that she maybe is not as much of a partier, but I don't know. I don't know her. Anyway, here's a quote from her. When a journalist asked me whether I was surprised that Eileen had made it to the Booker shortlist, I scoffed and did what I was raised to do. I spoke with certainty and confidence about myself and my work. I told him I felt deserving of the honor because I did. I'd written an excellent book. Nobody had helped me. Nobody told me to do it. I didn't owe a debt. I'd made something I was proud of. The blowback from this interview was amazing. Is it really so audacious for a debut author to be self-assured, even arrogant about her work? It was.